So I'm here today to talk to you about something I've been calling full-featured art direction, which in this context, it would be full-featured art direction inside of design systems. So as Brad said before, hi, my name is Mina. That's a lovely illustration that Estelle Way got done for me, and I love it. You can find me on Twitter, at Mina Markham is my handle, my very outdated website, mina.codes. Feel free to look at my old information there. So a little bit about me, although Brad pretty much covered it. I've worked on two vastly different but pretty high-profile design systems. The first one I made was for Hillary for America back in 2016, or actually 2015 and 2016. I made it for the entire, all the web properties on the campaign, so that was a pretty big deal. And the one place that I currently work right now is this company called Slack. Anybody ever heard of it? Anyone use the product by any chance? I do need to see your hands. Do you use the product? There we go, that's what I'm talking about. But I actually don't work on the part you're probably most familiar with. I don't work on the Slack product at all. As Brad mentioned, I work on what's called the customer acquisition team, which really is a fancy name for I build the website. I run the design system that powers all of our marketing properties, so that's mainly Slack.com, but it's also things like SlackHQ.com, which is our official blog that our content editors use. And so those are the projects that I've been keeping in mind as I've been thinking about design systems. So I said that my talk today is going to be about art direction, specifically inside of design systems. And I'm going to start by doing the boring thing and defining what I mean here. So what exactly is art direction? Well, one of my favorite definition comes from Dan Mall. He described it in one of his blog posts he wrote a few years ago, where it says that art direction combines art and design to invoke a cultural and emotional reaction. So essentially what that boils down to is that design is the how and art direction is the why. But in this instance, it would be design systems are the how and art direction is the why. This whole thing kind of boils down to, does what you're building feel good? Art direction it directs how something feels. So does it feel good to your end user? Now I'm going to do something really controversial at a design systems conference. I'm going to attempt to define what design systems are to a bunch of design system professionals. So let's see how this works out. I'm first going to cover a couple of definitions that other people put out there that I like. The first one comes from Marco, who says that a design system is a collection of reusable components guided by clear standards that can be assembled together to build any number of applications. Okay, pretty cool. Brad says that a design system is the story of how your organization makes products. Okay, I like that one. It's a decent one too. Gina says that design systems are not just about style guides, component libraries, UI kits, etc. A good design system empowers change in your company culture. Ooh, I like that one. That's a decent one, yeah. When you think about design systems, I kind of see and hear a bunch of different terms thrown around all the time. Components and guidelines, and is it in React, and what framework are you using, and what about your principles, and how do you handle spacing, and all that good stuff. There's this diagram that I really enjoy that kind of shows all the different pieces that can be involved in what a design system is. And I totally agree with that. All these pieces and more are a part of what a design system actually encompasses. But something that I've noticed a lot lately is that we seem to have this kind of hyper-focus on the one part of it. Everything's all about, the components, building out the components. How can we make our components integrated with everything else? I feel like we have this hyper-focus on the one piece, and we're losing sight of all the other parts that are equally as important. So here comes my, very boiled down, simple definition of what a design system is. A design system is, at its foundation, a set of rules. The rules that govern how you create products for your specific brand. And the good thing about this particular definition is that it means that rules and creativity are not mutually exclusive. A big thing that a big criticism I hear about design systems is that they inhibit creativity, or they stifle designers, or they make everything look the same and too rigid. And if you think of it as just a set of rules, you can very easily see that rules can be broken. You can go outside of the system if your use case really does invoke that. Now, I say this, and I feel like a bit of a hypocrite, because anyone who's ever worked with me knows that I am all about sticking to the system. I really, really hate when people go outside the system, try to go around the system. Like, I go to war every single time it happens. I'm just like, no, you don't need that one-off. No, we don't need this. Stop it. And it kind of ends the exact same way where I end up getting trampled and run over. But I started to reshape my thinking about this, where we don't have to have one or the other. We can have a nice, consistent foundation of tried and true, tested UI elements, and then have the nice layer on top that is more expressive and is more creative and is more innovative for that particular page, talking about marketing properties at this point. Alice Lee, who did a lot of the illustrations for the first version of Slack.com I worked on, she said something that was pretty on point to me. She was talking about illustrations in this instance, but she said that there's a time and a place for both. Illustrations can be used as you have the stock components that serve as your foundational work, but you can also have the intentional complex extension of the original brand. So you, like I said, have that nice foundation there, but then have the more expressive intentional extensions on top of it. Essentially, this tension comes down to what you can call a strict design system or a loose design system. Like a strict design system is like, no, everything has to be by the book. There's no deviation. Everything is right where it needs to be. These are the rules. A more loose design system probably has some general guidelines. Maybe doesn't come with a component library. Just kind of tells you, here are the general rules for how to stay within our brand, and you can kind of go within those. So I think that product design probably lends itself more towards a stricter design system, and the editorial world and marketing world could probably lean more towards the loosely defined design systems. Essentially, what I'm trying to say here is that I'm going to stop trying to fight the snowflakes. I want design systems to stop trying to fight these special snowflakes that need to go outside of it or around it. And instead, I want to be able to enable these snowflakes to to do what they need to do, but still stick within the guidelines and principles we all agreed on. So there's three different ways, or three different topics and ideas I have in my mind for how we can enable the snowflakes, enable designers to bring more creativity back into their system. Okay, so the first one here is we need to be able to provide a better default experience for our end user. And what I mean by that is something that Rachel Andrew, she went on a bit of a Twitter rant about something that was was bothering her, because she kept seeing this mentality happen over and over again, where people were talking about they couldn't use CSS Grid or whatever, or the new hotness because it wasn't supported in XYZ browser. And because all of our sites have to look the same in every browser, which, are we really still talking about that? Do they really still have to look the same in every browser? And so I think this is kind of, in my mind, I imagine Rachel dropping the mic after she had tweeted. She's like, no, I'm done with this. I built them to work everywhere and to support as many places as possible. But look the same? No, it's not possible at all. In case this is news to people, things looking different in every browser is not actually a bug. It's a feature of CSS. I think it's a feature it's a feature of progressive enhancement, actually, because we want to be able to have everyone have the best experience for their particular situation and not force our vision on them. Andy Bell actually says this a little bit more eloquently than I did. He wrote this great article on progressive enhancement, and he essentially says that a complete mindset change is required, and it starts by remembering that you don't build websites for yourself, you build them for others. So with progressive enhancement, every user should have their own experience of the site rather than the experience that designers and developers demand of them. And I've been calling this, there should be a default experience that works for the vast majority of users, and anything else on top of that should be more, I don't want to say flourish, because that diminishes the actual role of design, but I do want to say anything you add on top of that shouldn't be required for the default experience. A better analogy I have for this is one of my favorite things, cake. I love cake. I love baking. I love to bake goods. And this is a very great kind of illustration of what I'm talking about. If you think of like the bare minimum HTML as the cake part of it, CSS as the icing or frosting, and then JavaScript as the sprinkles and toppings and whatnot, if you don't put the frosting and icing and sprinkles on top, people still get cake. And in fact, there are some people out there, I don't understand them, but there are some people out there who actually just want the cake. They scrape off all the icing part of it. And so they still get the experience they want. They still get the default cake, but then I can come in and grab my icing, grab my sprinkles, grab everything else because I want the more enriched, enhanced experience. Okay, so how does this actually apply to websites? How I've been doing it is I build things markup first. And what I mean by that is when I get comps or designs from my design partners, I look at them and I make this joke that I see designs and layouts the way Neo sees the Matrix. So I look at this and I'm just like, okay, so I know what's going on here. This is going to be the header right here. There's the nav. We got the 1H1 because you only need one on the page. All those boxes there, they're clickable, so they should be anchor links. And so I just kind of look at it and see what's the actual purpose of each part of this design, and then I build it with just the HTML first. And if I don't add the styling, of course, that page will end up looking something like this, which, granted, is ugly, but you can still read it. And Google AMP and Reader don't actually do much more than this. So, it's still pretty usable. Now, I'm not suggesting we actually go out and build websites like this. But my point is that by building it markup first, if catastrophic failure happens and all my JavaScript doesn't render, my CSS breaks, people can still read the article, which is really what they came there to do. So I'm going to use this particular article that's on our Slack blog right now. It's called How We Localized Slack. And I'm going to use this as an example, kind of coming down the road here. But here's what the experience looks like by default right now on the desktop app. When I strip away everything else, most of the styling, just let the browser do its bare minimum default styling. This is what it looks like, which again is not great, not pretty, but you can read the thing, which is all I really want to do. So, hey, congratulations, you're basic, it's cool. So people might be sitting out there thinking, okay, but really though, is this necessary? Who disables JavaScript anymore? Maybe it doesn't necessarily mean that when I say that we should be building a default experience, first of all, I don't actually mean no JavaScript. I just mean it shouldn't be integral or blocking to people coming to do what they needed to do. But there are instances where a user who has not disabled JavaScript may not actually get it. For one, it could just fail to load for various reasons. They could have an ad blocker enabled, which would probably block all JavaScript on the page, or they could be just on a really slow network and it takes forever to load. This actually happened to me when I went to a conference in South Africa earlier this year, and I was trying to load something on our hotel Wi-Fi, and I was in Cape Town. I was in a pretty urban area of the country, but the Wi-Fi was just not working with me, and every time I tried to go to some website or read some article, it was just like pulling teeth to get everything to load, and I got so frustrated, I just stopped. So I want to be able to I think we need to do a better job of planning for those experiences, planning for being on slow, crappy airport and airline Wi-Fi and whatnot. And we do that by building progressively. And that means we can avoid using a bunch of polyfills and fixes for old browsers by basically providing a simpler method for what the end goal is. So in my case, providing a simpler method means just letting the content actually render on the page regardless if the CSS is there. But in certain actual applications that require some JavaScript functionality, a simpler method could be a little bit different. This is mybrowser.fyi is a site that Andy Bell made, and he built it with his idea of progressive enhancement in mind. Here's the actual enriched, fully featured experience, where if you go to the site, it'll pull it up and it reads the configuration of your browser and of your viewport and gives you back information in this nice formatted form. And I can't remember, forgive me, I can't remember the exact service or the exact API he relies on to make this happen, but should that part fail, it'll go to the fallback here, or the next experience, where it just gives you the same information in a bunch of JSON. It's not pretty, but you still get to see what you came there to see, so that's fine. I think that if a catastrophic failure happens, you can't see anything, there still is a bare minimum default experience there where you can just actually click the button, which is literally a web form at this point, click the button, and it will then do a request and send you back information that way. So it's pretty cool that there are kind of tiers and layers of experience, and none of them feels like a degraded experience. None of them feels like you're missing something. It just feels like you have a different experience, which is what I want to kind of iterate and reiterate and promote to people. So there might be some people waiting and saying, come on, though, really, is this still an issue? Well, apparently, people who were in my workshop on Monday actually saw me go through this exercise live, but I went to a couple of websites that won, you know that thing called awards with the www in it? So I went to a few of their sites of the day just to kind of see the ones who were winning, like either side of the week or side of the day or whatever. I went to a few of the ones who won to kind of test out this theory. So I came across this one called The Future of Web.Design, which has this really cool interactive timeline to where if you scroll, the dates kind of count up and you can see what the web was like in that particular year. It's a very cool experience. So as an experiment, I'm like, okay, let me just go ahead and disable JavaScript real quick. Let's see what happens. Yeah. It's just like, really? There's just, the layout of this is not that complex that we wouldn't be able to serve just a bare minimum content. Like, it really is just pictures, paragraph, pictures, paragraph. And granted, I know that's probably all being delivered via JavaScript because there's very beautiful animations happening, but it just kind of sucks that if I happen to be in a situation where I couldn't download all of that, I basically get nothing but a sorry, you need to go figure out your life and you need to go, basically, it kind of feels like you need to go check your priorities and get JavaScript enabled. It's kind of what that feels like to me. So anyways, I would like us to start thinking about how we can use design systems to build a better default experience that doesn't basically tell the end user that, sorry, you don't have what I require you to have to view my content. The next kind of feature I want to talk about is how to build a solid, inclusive, or accessible foundation into your design systems. Now, I know there's been a lot of talks about that. Marcy did a great job about talking about it yesterday, excuse me. Here, I want to go through a little bit of how I tried to bake in some good accessibility foundation into the two systems that I worked on earlier. So the good news is that if I follow the workflow that I outlined earlier and I build everything marked up first with semantic HTML, a lot of the lift has been done already. So I started right there with a decent foundation just by ensuring that I'm using the appropriate elements for what I'm actually trying to do. So this here is Kat Holmes, and she at one point she was at Microsoft. I'm not sure she's still there, but she's a big name in inclusive design, and she says that inclusive design is not a result, but it is a process. And I take that hold to heart, and I try to have a very inclusive process in everything that I do. And having an inclusive process when you're trying to build anything for the web, but particularly design systems, it can actually help you to avoid a lot of really embarrassing and really kind of hurtful experience with the end user. One of the more famous ones that I like to point out is this situation that happened a few years ago with Google Photos, where a black man, he uploaded a bunch of photos of him and his friend to Google Photos, and it used AI and machine learning to kind of try to categorize the photos for him. And he noticed that the photos of him and his friend were labeled as gorillas, which is an incredibly offensive thing to put next to pictures of black people. And I'm not gonna say that anyone here was intentionally harmful. It seems clear to me that at no point in the process, either the data that was training the AI, the people who were testing it, in no part of that process was there a dark-skinned person involved. Because if there were, I'm not going to say it would have definitely been caught, but it could have been caught, and this could have been avoided by having a more inclusive design and engineering process from the get-go. Same thing with more physical design, where I've had this happen to me multiple times. It's incredibly frustrating when I'm trying to get some soap or trying to get the water turned on or trying to get paper towels or whatever, and it just won't recognize my hand because my hand is darker than whatever that sensor was designed to pick up, which is just so frustrating because I can't. You can just imagine like sitting there with your damp, wet hands, you're just trying and there's nothing happens, and so I have to like wipe on my pants like a plebe and just kind of feel second class while I do it. It's very frustrating. So the first time I actually really practiced having a more inclusive design process, it was back when I was working for Hillary for America, when I was working with my pantsuit partner in crime here, Victor. Victor was the lead web designer for HillaryClinton.com, and he and I developed a very close working relationship because we were the two kind of pantsuit stars, so to speak, where we were the ones who were designing and implementing the entire design system ourselves. And so we did this thing where instead of going through the whole wireframe, comp, and implementation process, we would do something that we either called it pair designing or pixel engineering, depending on the mood we were in. But essentially what it meant was he would sit down next to me, draw a wireframe, basically tell me, here are the components and the pieces of pantsuit I think should be there. So I would start building based on his wireframe and the knowledge of what was already in the system. And then as I was building in real time, we would kind of find the pain points as I was showing how it lived and moved in the browser. He would start sketching out how to correct some problems he was seeing. So that was like a really good rapport. And it wasn't the whole, move this pixel down one thing. It was actually a much more collaborative design process. And as we started getting more and more comfortable with each other, I was tasked with making HillaryClinton.com accessibly compliant. I was going for AA accessibility level, which I'll talk about later. And in that process, as I was learning more and more about how to accomplish that goal, because he and I had this rapport, we started trying to pull in as much people as possible who actually were more representative of what we were trying to do. It was kind of hard for the two of us to figure out what made something accessible and what didn't, because we were not the target, the user for this. So what we ended up doing was we actually went to one of our voter support groups. It was like People with Disabilities for Hillary or something like that. And we went to them and asked them to come and do a focus group with us to tell us what was hard about using our site. And in doing that, we uncovered a lot of pain points that would have been a blind spot to us had we not had that conversation. And one thing we learned was that people who had visual impairment sometimes didn't feel like they could partake fully in like the campaign swag kind of phenomenon. And so Victor ended up doing this really cool thing where he created these Braille buttons that had like Braille lettering on them so that people with visual impairments could actually truly experience the button and feel more like they can feel more part of the campaign, so to speak. Another cool thing that ended up happening was we realized that when we had the logo represented on the website, we would provide decent alt text that basically said, the name Hillary for America or something like that, but it still didn't quite give them the same experience as a sighted user would have. So what we ended up doing was, I'll just actually show you what we ended up doing. Let's see if the sound is going to work here.
The Hillary for America logo is based on a perfect square grid, 3 squares tall and 3 squares wide. The middle squares are removed from the top and bottom rows, revealing the capital H letter form. An arrow sits across the crossbar of the H, pointing forward.
So that voice you hear is actually the logo designer, Michael Beirut, and he's describing the logo as he sees it. So it's pretty cool to have, we put this out on our social media for, I think, the anniversary of the Americans with Disability Act. And it was a very interesting experience to let people with limited vision actually experience the logo the way the designer intended. He's describing it as he sees it. So they're essentially getting the same experience as someone who can see the logo. Actually, they're probably getting a better experience because most people who saw the logo wouldn't have Michael Beirut telling them exactly what it looks like and exactly how it looks like to him. So I think they actually got a better experience. So going through all of that, that inclusive process actually came in, besides making these really more inclusive and enhanced experience for our users and voters who had visual impairments. It actually came in pretty handy when I had to have some tough conversations with our design team, namely when I had to tell them that the lovely color palette that they had so lovingly created and told over was completely inaccessible. That white on blue it's very low contrast. People who can't see low contrast have no idea what's going on. The way I described it was, there are people out there who cannot give us money because they cannot see what that button says to give us money. And I felt kind of bad going back and saying, hey, this entire color palette doesn't work. We need to change it. And he looked at me, Victor looked at me and was like, that's everywhere. That's the entire brand palette. I'm like, yeah, I know, but it's not accessible. We have to change it. And so there were tears. There were a little bit of tears involved. It took a little bit of time to kind of go through and actually redo everything and make it more, improve the color contrast. But I'm really happy we did, because it ended up looking much, much better. I think it looks better in general, but the most important part is that people can actually see and use it now, which is great. Okay, so I want to transition here to I told you a little bit of a story about working on the Hillary for America website. But one thing that I learned from that experience that I'm still taking with me in my future endeavors is one thing that I was doing, and I'm sure a lot of people continue to do, is that when I build sites, I inadvertently remove all the default accessibility from certain features, particularly the focus ring and the tabability of it. And I wasn't doing it because I actually intended to do it. It's just for something I didn't actually think about actively before. So one rule that I have now is I don't remove any of the defaults from the browser style, at least not that particular default. Removing the focus outline is like removing the wheelchair ramp from a building because you don't like the aesthetic of it. The reason that we tend to remove that focus ring is because it's ugly and usually doesn't match your brand guidelines. Most of the time it's just kind of blue, fuzzy, faded thing that just kind of shows up and you don't really know why it's there. But what I've been trying to get my design team to do, and what we've been doing going forward, is that instead of removing the defaults, we've been designing better defaults. So going back to the Hillary campaign, when I was building out the accessibility and tabability of the site, you can see here, this is me tabbing through the site, and for the most part, some of the ones are just inheriting the hover state. But if you wait until we get down to the links, I actually added this this white, thick outline around every link so you can visually see where you are as you're tabbing through. And I added this without design input, which, no for me. And so I put it up there and it was live, and then maybe a few days later when someone finally noticed, I got someone walking up to my desk like, Mina, why are these white outlines all over the site? It's like, well, we need it because people who use the tab need to be able to see what they're tabbing. And they're like, well, why do they need to see what they're tabbing? They assume that people who were using the tab actually were visually impaired and couldn't see the site, so I had to do a little bit of education saying, no, sighted users can tab if they have motor impairments. And so there's a little bit of education happening there. But once they understood why it was there, then we had to have a compromise because they thought that the focus state was ugly and distracting. And I kind of wanted to put my foot down and say, but we need it. It has to be there. You can't really argue with the CPO of a campaign, all that. You can, but you don't always win, and in this instance, I didn't win. And so we compromised with, I don't know if you can see it because, again, it's not very high contrast, but there is a very light dotted white outline around the links when you tab over them in this instance, which was a compromise that still had something there, and it made the CPO happy, but it still didn't quite meet the requirements I was going for because it's hard to see. I'm looking at it right now, and I actually can't see what's happening. So it was a compromise, but I think the user got the short end of the stick for that one. Going towards Slack, we did the exact same thing where I started by telling the designers, I need you to build me not just a hover state, but a focus state. So I let them take control of what that looked like from the beginning. So I learned a lesson from that. I'm going to say, here's the requirement. Please figure out what you think is best. And so what they came back was something pretty similar, which is a slightly thinner white outline as you're tabbing through everything. And that was achieved by me doing just very simple, high-level focus state that essentially adds a focus outline to literally everything unless you override it. So it was very kind of a little bit of an aggressive default, but still, I'd rather it be there than nothing was there. When I did this, I did have the same pushback where they were not happy, people were not happy that it showed up on click, because they were like, oh, it's for tabbing, so why does it show up when I'm trying to click through the site? Well, if you didn't know, focus state is triggered by both click and tab, and as of right now, there's no real way to differentiate, but hopefully soon, when focus visible is actually supported in all browsers, we can actually alleviate this particular pain point and just say, if I want to see the focus state, here are my styles. Otherwise, let's just not show anything. So then we can all have all of our users like tabbing through happily, and everyone can have a great experience. So I'm going to go through more of what I did for Slack really quickly here. The first thing I did was I wrote out an actual accessibility guidelines based on the standards that were set by the WCAG. And so I just focused on, here are some of the main things I think we can hit while building out this brand new system, this brand new site. And if you notice, I said the first thing I say is I'm reaching for AA compliance. And essentially what that means is that, 1A is required to be accessible. That's the bare minimum you can do. AA is, better. AAA is great, amazing, you're hitting all the points. Or as I like to think about them, we got your requirements, we got your attainable, and then you get the ones that are like kind of hard. Because to get AAA, you usually need to have downloadable transcripts for all of your videos, closed captioning on the videos. But in some cases, you need to have a feature for sign language interpretation. Like sometimes it's kind of hard to hit all of those checkpoints, but AA is completely attainable for most people. Now I do want to pause here and give like a really big caveat and say, making accessible components will not make your project accessible. It will make the individual pieces accessible, but there are still, full page level compliance issues that you need to attend with. One being making sure that the page itself has logical hierarchy, and that screeners rely on that hierarchy to actually go through and navigate. So it's very important that you test not just the components part of it, but the page level part of it as well. And the way that I did that was, like I said, creating better defaults. This was actually the slide way back when I started with Slack, and it's not moving. There we go. All I did for this one is I colored the default focus ring a different color to match our brand guidelines, and that was fine for the beginning, but when we redid it the second time, I actually wanted designers to go ahead and provide me a better state than that. But I also provided some landmarks so that assistive technologies can actually figure out where things were on the page. On the framework level, I made a bunch of helper classes and helper functions that will allow people to create new things and still have accessibility in mind. One thing I did was I separated the semantic elements from the actual styling of it. So if you want something to look really big and jumbo, you can say the display is H1. But it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be the H1. In all likelihood, it would be, but just in case it's not for visual reasons, you can still use the proper semantic element as H1 and then have whatever you want to be big, use a class. Same thing with like is focusable or for screen reader only. And we also had this print style where if someone were to print out the page, we would add the URL into the printed document after a link so they can actually see where these things would have taken them. So one key to staying accessible was having good success criteria for your QA team. Our QA team is the ones who keep us accountable and keep us accessible. I would get messages like this copied into our channel pretty frequently where people would say, please make sure that you follow XYZ guideline for accessibility compliance. And it's usually alt text. For some reason, it's very hard to get good alt text from people. So I'm constantly having to remind and educate our content team about what good alt text looks like. But we didn't solely rely on automated testing, although we did rely on Axe quite a bit to catch some of the easy, low-hanging fruit. We did go through and do a very thorough manual QA process as well to catch anything that the automated test might not have caught or might have did a false positive on. So all of this that I've done, all of these things I've done for both Slack and Hillary for America, I feel like I have a pretty good handle on accessibility compliance. So much so that I feel like I can up my game a bit, and I can help out those who might need a little bit of help. You know, like my poor girl Beyonce here. Like, do you know she's getting sued because people can't use her website, which admittedly is not accessible and kind of atrocious? I love her, but yes, it is. So what I ended up doing, I saw this article that she was getting sued because her site's not accessible, and I was like, I actually know how to fix this problem. So as a joke, really, I tweeted out to her, say, hey, I can help solve your problem. I'm actually pretty good at this. You should DM me. I indeed opened my DMs. They're still open to this day. I'm waiting for that DM. I haven't gotten contact, not by her, not by her team. I don't know, man. But you can actually help me out here, though. My friend Amelie, she took it to a next level here. And she's really, really trying to get me hired by Beyonce. She wants this to happen. So I'm going to leave the slide up for a second. I want you to go to that, I'm serious, go to that website right now and sign this petition and help me get my dream job. I don't see y'all pulling out phones or anything. Okay. All right, so all kidding aside, I kid about being able to, actually I really do want to do this, but if you want to, going back to you being able to put more accessibility compliance built into your system, there actually are a couple of good systems. Well, there's many good systems out there, but here are two systems I think that have some really in-depth, really well-documented accessibility guidelines. One being the Carbon Design System. They have some very in-depth accessibility guidelines there that I think work they have some for developers only and some for the designers, so I think it's a really good example of how to write good success criteria and good guidelines for a design system. There's also one for the United States Digital Service. They have this accessibility.digital.gov, which is actually a guide for the people who adopt their design system to build on top of the good work they already did. Because as I mentioned before, a design system by itself will not make you compliant. You have to do work on top of it. So this is a really good guide to give your end users to say, here's how you build on top of everything that we've already done. Okay, so lastly, what I want to talk about is localize your visual language. And this is one that I've been thinking about for the past year or so because we've been doing lots of localization things on Slack.com. Right after we built the version of Slack.com when I first got there, immediately after it launched, we worked on localizing it in a bunch of new languages. We initially started with 4 new languages, but as of today, we are available in, I believe, what is this? 1, 2, 3, 4. I can't count because my eyes are blurry right now. But we are available in all of these countries and language pairs. So it's a little bit different from what the product does because the product actually is a language preference. They go on what language you want to represent the product in. Slack.com is actually by country and region and then language on top of it. Some countries actually could have multiple languages, but we are focused on localizing for country versus language, and there's a key reason for that, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But there's this one thing that we do on the site where we represent the Slack product in a kind of abstract way. We have this very abstracted view of what the Slack product looks like with the sidebar of channels and then a message pane right there in the middle. And so when we started localizing the site, we started going through and translating all of these things into the appropriate language. And we all thought that this was great. We were like, okay, this is localized, this is done. And it wasn't until our Japanese interpreter actually saw the page she was translating for and came to us and said, this is wrong, this is very weird, and we shouldn't do this. And we were all very, very confused with what she was talking about. And we realized, just like, it's weird to show Western people having a conversation in Japanese. It's a strange experience for a Japanese native user. And it's not something that any of us would have ever thought or thought about until she mentioned it. And what this kind of lends itself to is the concept of doing localization and not translation. Translation is literally just taking the words on the page and changing them to a different language. What we want to do is actually reinterpret the experience on the page and make sure that the entire experience is represented appropriately in that region and in that culture. So a better experience for doing that was, in lieu of having actual images of Japanese users, we removed all the Western faces and put color blocks in as a stopgap. We also went through and changed all of our illustrations that featured more darker-skinned characters and changed them to be more representative to what a Japanese user would expect to see. Good news is, after we launched all of our new languages earlier this year, we did end up launching the new localized UIs as well that have fully responsive, I don't want to say responsive in this sense, I mean fully localized avatars for the product UIs. And the way that we're handling that is with design tokens. Design tokens for the win, yes. So a design token for our avatar looks a little bit like this. I am an avatar, we call them a persona internally, but I am a persona, my face is a persona on the app that represents a user, and I am persona A. And so persona A looks like this by default, it looks like me by default. But if I were to use persona A in a country where, for whatever reason, my face might not be the most accurate representation of a user, I sometimes become different people. So if you look at the same site in Germany, I become a white woman. If you look at the same site in in Japan, I become a Japanese woman. Same thing with India, I become an Indian woman. So this looks like, here's how that actually looks in real life. So persona A, the default experience is the United States in English, and persona A is my face with the name Zoe Maxwell. I came up with that myself. I thought it was nice and clever. So if you go look at the same page in Brazil, it's still my face, but my name is changed to something to more regionally appropriate. If you look at the same thing, like I said, in Germany, it becomes a different face and a different name. If you look at that in India, again, different face, different name. Same thing with Japan, different face, different name. So we fully localize our representation of the Slack product on slack.com to be more representative of what the end user in that country would expect to see. And the way we do this is by adding as much context as possible for our localization team. We always try to gather as much context as possible. I get these, they're not really bugs, they're more requests for information from our team multiple times because I, at the beginning, didn't provide enough context for them, so they were constantly asking me, what is the context of this phrase? What is the context of this particular image on the page? And as I kept explaining, I was wondering why they wanted so much context. And our localization team told me that what they're trying to do, I alluded to it earlier, is they're trying to make sure they represent the Slack voice. Our brand voice is very strong. They want to make sure that we represent the Slack voice as accurately as possible in that local region, which means not only trying to capture the witty sort of tone that Slack has, but also use local idioms and potentially slang that they would be used to. So they need to know as much information as possible. And the reason they do this is because by appealing and customizing all of our content to be very specific to that region, it builds trust in our global users. And it makes it so that no matter where they are in the world accessing Slack, if we have localized for that country, it feels like it originated in their country. So in that sense, context for all of this is everything. So I want to kind of dive deeper into this concept a little bit. As I was thinking about how much care they take with localizing the actual words and voice we use, I was curious to know how can we apply that same theory to the visual interfaces, our visual language? How can we apply that much care to localizing the actual layout of the page? So what I started doing was started looking at a bunch of sites. I started with Japan because it was the culture I had the least context for. So I was looking at sites that were in that region to see how do they approach design, what are the aesthetics that they like, what are the aesthetics that they're used to. And so I was seeing a bunch of different sites. Some of them are very colorful, some of them are like pretty plain and dense, some of them are really very dense. And I had some uncomfortable thoughts as I was looking at a few of them. Part of me was like, these are kind of like ugly. Why is the design so bad? And then I had to like stop myself and say, wait a minute, the design's not bad, it's just not what I'm used to. This is perfectly acceptable and perfectly reasonable and expected for users in that country. What I was doing when I looked at it and was thinking that it didn't match what I think is a good design aesthetic, I realized I was doing something that Amelie calls the hegemonic design gaze. And so she calls the hegemonic design gaze is it dictates what good and bad design is from a dominant or usually Eurocentric point of view, with a little value for the target audience's aesthetic viewpoint or utility or their environment. So essentially it just means that I'm looking at everything through the Western lens that I was taught and not considering what the context is for the user in a culture that's not my own. One of my friends, Yiying Liu, is actually really good at globalizing and localizing designs for various cultures. So a few years ago, back when Disney Resort in Shanghai was opening, she was asked to create the assets for a recruitment campaign to get more Chinese workers to actually want to apply and work at the resort. And she was given the stipulation that it needed to feel like Disney, but it also needed to feel very different from American Disney. It had to feel like it was in China. It had to feel Chinese. And so what she was doing was like taking some iconic Disney characters like Mickey and Snow White and Elsa and had to figure out a way to make them feel still like they were Disney, but also feel like they were very distinctly Chinese. So what she ended up doing was she ended up going and creating all of these different character designs using a traditional Chinese paper cut style or aesthetic. And what that looks like is these really beautiful and intricate designs made with paper, usually red paper, I feel, and it just kind of has this very distinct style and aesthetic attached to it and has a very significant cultural meaning to the people of China. Now, granted, I was told by her that it's actually more of a older tradition that may be kind of dying out, but it still has meaning to the people in China, and they would recognize what this means. And so what she did was she took that style and applied it to the Disney characters. And so she came up with something that still feels pretty Disney, but also feels like very distinctly and uniquely Chinese. If you can see the detail on like Mickey, the patterns on Mickey's outfit, those slippers are actually like very traditional slippers that infants might wear. So the target audience would actually recognize what those mean. It's not just a pretty pattern. Even with Snow White, adding again the same kind of intricate details on the dress, and the same thing with Elsa. Like it's kind of very cool and very, very distinctly for that particular target audience and that particular culture, which I think it was done, pretty well and pretty beautifully. She was saying that you have to respect, recognize, and infuse your target market's custom into your designs when you're trying to appeal to a specific local region. So going with that mentality, I started thinking, is it possible to have like a visual language for different countries and different locales? So I did a little thought experiment, and I looked at, does anybody here know what the Public Theater is in New York City? Yeah, so I looked at the Public Theater. They have a very strong brand, a very strong visual identity. The Public Theater, if you don't know, it's this great theater in New York that houses a bunch of off-Broadway plays where sometimes they actually tend to go and be on Broadway and be very successful, but it's where a lot of them got their start. For example, Hamilton started in the Public Theater. It was workshopped there for a while, and that was where they built what the Hamilton show ultimately ended up looking like, was in that particular theater. The creative director for that theater is Paula Scheer. She's been that creative director for probably decades at this point. And she was talking about how it was hard to figure out how to create a visual identity for this theater with all the various different independent shows it would have. Because if she made the same thing every single year over and over again, it would get kind of boring and kind of played. So here's a couple of examples of like a very strong aesthetic that if you repeat it multiple times over a year, you can kind of see how it starts to, it's still very striking in my mind, but you can kind of see how it starts to become kind of I don't want to say rote, but it becomes kind of like very consistent, doesn't have a lot of visual differences between the two. But if she changed it individually for every single play, then the theater as a whole lost its identity. So here's some examples of like every single play having its own unique brand and unique style, but you wouldn't actually know these all were created and produced in the same theater unless you went to go look for them. So this sounds very familiar to me. It sounds like the tension between building something consistently building a consistent part of the design system across multiple properties, but still wanting each either article or each special feature to have something that makes it unique and brings it to the next level. So the way that she solved this tension was she would take the color and typography system and translate those into a seasonal standards manual, which essentially means that every year the public theater gets a new identity, which could seem a little bit excessive, like every year you change the brand guidelines, but I've done a redesign or a rebrand the last 3 of the 4 years of my career, so it's not unheard of to change your brand and your visual styles every single year. But essentially what she is saying is she's going to change the design, the visual design language of her system seasonally so that it still stays fresh. And the way that that could kind of apply to a design system was, here's the style she had for one specific season. It has this very striking, like these very big angles for the typography, has this kind of like cut and like sliced types imagery. The pink and black is very striking. And how that would actually translate in my mind to a system would be, okay, here's the color palette, and here's some examples of how typography and the imagery should look. If you go to a different year, here's again a different year, a different season, has this very consistent for the entire season, but very different and striking from the previous one. And that could potentially translate to a system in that sense. So I wanted to play around and see, could I actually do something similar to this for a different language? So going back to that article I told you about earlier, that's How We Localize Slack article. It's actually been translated into Japanese. It was already translated on its own, so I took the Japanese version of it, and I decided I wanted to localize the design of it, the visual aspects of it, to see if I could make it feel more Japanese. Now, I want to stop right here and say, huge caveat, I am not Japanese. I don't read or speak Japanese, and so I tried to do my best to be as respectful as possible when researching what the Japanese aesthetic looks like, so that I was not being unintentionally offensive, and I will apologize in advance if I happen to be. But here is some of the designs I saw when I was researching the Japanese design aesthetic, and I kept seeing the same motif of having this bright, the big red circle, sometimes vertical type, and it was lots and lots of very striking red imagery and the red circle imagery, which I learned signifies the sun in Japan. They use red to symbolize the sun versus yellow in Western culture, so that has a very unique meaning to the people of Japan. And so I started doing this by using the almighty Lang pseudo class. I've used this to create localized styles for the same pieces of UI. And the way that you use it is, inside the parentheses, you just put the two-letter code for whatever language you're trying to target, and then add your styles. So if I were to style that article I showed you to be a little different for Japanese, I would use some CSS grid and some writing modes to change the layout of the headline and make the text vertical. I would then just sort of lay out the body copy and headlines a little bit differently according to grid, and that ended up looking a bit like this, which, it's not bad. It looks pretty good, but it could be improved on. I don't like the red clashing with that image right there, so I added a bit more flair to it, a little bit of filtering, and ended up something that looked a little bit more like this. So to me, that's like, okay, that's just a few lines of code, but that definitely makes this article look and feel more targeted towards the Japanese language versus just the default experience we had before. And how that ended up looking in the browser was a bit like this. And I said, okay, that's pretty good, but I can add a little bit more. I can make it just a little bit more, a little bit fun. So what I ended up doing was I added a silly animation that had sort of made the sun become the beating heart. Like, that's what it symbolized to me, the beating heart of Japan. But the way I did this was I made sure to do it in an accessible and inclusive way. I hide the animation styles behind a feature query that checks to see if people have this configuration of prefers reduced motion turned on. If they have it turned on, it doesn't animate. If they have it turned off, it will animate, but if that browser doesn't even support that particular configuration at all, you don't get the animation. Like, I only will show it if your browser supports that configuration and you have it turned on or turned off, whichever one makes actual sense on that one. So anyways, I hide the kind of extra delight part of it for people who actually opt into it. I didn't want to force anyone to deal with the animation if they didn't really kind of opt into it. So I alluded to it earlier, but I was kind of hesitant to go through this exercise because I was like, is this cultural appropriation? Am I doing something bad here? And what this kind of boils down to is, context is everything in this situation. What I'm attempting to do is show my cultural appreciation for Japanese people and Japanese culture, and what that essentially means is that I'm trying to understand the significance of a particular tradition and not undermine or destroy its significance. And I'm understanding the histories of oppression or marginalization that may be attached to this particular object or particular behavior or action I'm trying to do, and I'm trying to be cognizant of those things when I'm doing my designs. Now, if I were to go down the appropriation road, what I'm essentially doing is I'm playing on historical themes of oppression and privilege, or basically I'm ignoring all significance and all value that particular object may have, and just using it for aesthetic value and not thinking about the actual meaning behind it. And I don't necessarily give credit to where it came from. So if I did this a very distinctly looking Chinese style, like if I did the paper cut style for something that was not even remotely related to China, and just did it because I thought it looked cool, that could be construed, that could be interpreted as cultural appropriation. To give you some more recent and more pop culture examples of cultural appropriation, that would be Kim Kardashian naming her line kimono when it had absolutely nothing to do with Japanese culture. I think she has since decided to rename it because she got such backlash about it, but that would be an example of appropriation. I may get in trouble for this one, but Aquafina is an example of cultural appropriation. The black scent that she adopts when she speaks, that makes her sound like a sassy African-American woman, that is considered cultural appropriation, because if I, an actual black woman, did the exact same thing in mannerisms, it would come across as derogatory I would not get famous off of it. People would look down on me for it. So that's a couple of examples of what appropriation versus appreciation can look like. And unfortunately, there are just a lot of examples of cultural appropriation in pop culture, and these are just a few of them. And essentially what I want to say is this right here is just not a good look. This is not how you want your brand, represented. So when you're thinking about doing localization and trying to appeal to a target market's particular culture, take very good and extra care to ensure that you are appreciating and respecting the cultures and respecting the significance behind what you're trying to do, when you're not offending people, you're not just trying to capitalize on their culture. And with that kind of downer note here, I just want to kind of recap what I was talking about, how you do art direction powered by design systems. You do that by progressively enhancing your default experiences. You start with inclusive, smart defaults, and you do localized by culture, but you do so with extreme care. And I want to say thank you all so much for your time, and I will see you later.
Holy crap. There was so much there.
Yeah. The funny thing is, I actually cut that talk a lot.
Oh my God. This could be a day-long discussion, but just obviously
it was a day-long
so.
workshop 2 days ago.
Well, there we go. Yeah. So just getting right into it. So is a few things, a theme that came up in sort of like a common thread between what you're talking about with, progressive enhancement, with things like the focus state, with things like the context. One thing that I'm just sort of in awe about is that you are sort of playing this role of educator, facilitator, gatekeeper, you're playing a lot of roles in addition to actually doing the freaking work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, which is impressive. And I think like developers historically have been sort of thought as like, you're showing a lot of code snippets, you know how all that stuff works, but you're able to sort of go back to your partners, right? Like your colleagues, and sort of help them better understand like how this all goes down. And I guess why I think it's important to bring that up is that oftentimes developers are thought of as like the code monkeys that just like, you get handed the thing and it's like this one-way street. So I guess my question is like, how did you arrive at that place where you're able to be like, yeah, so we're going to change the entire brand palette, or we're going to do this, like huge ramifications on like the overall sort of product, right? When, again, historically developers are thought of as like executors and nothing more. So like, how did you fight to get at that place?
Well, I consider myself to be a bit of a hybrid engineer designer. I started my career as a designer. If you want to pull out the credentials, I do have a degree in graphic design. I spent my first 5 years of my career as a print designer. So I do have that background in what good, quote unquote, good design is. And so I know how to relate to my design partners in a way that they are familiar with and understand. So I know how to translate all the code stuff I'm doing in a way that someone who may not actually understand code would be able to understand. I do that for not just my design partners, but also for stakeholders and pretty much anyone who's not technically savvy. Because I had that initial design background, I can very easily understand how it goes from here to here, and I do my best to explain that process to everyone who works with me.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's incredible. I mean, like, definitely a lot to take away. Like, again, if you don't feel like empowered as a developer, it's like I think you're just like clearly showing how it's like, yeah, you can be just such an important player in the design world. So. You talked, about so many things, like, biases, preconceptions, all of this stuff. Like, how do you in the teams you've worked on? It sounds like you've done a fantastic job. Your teams is sort of confronting and surfacing these sort of biases. Like for all the teams in the room that are doing these building design systems, building products. Like What advice do you have for them to sort of like surface these biases, surface these like, sort of pitfalls and potential pitfalls in a proactive way rather than going, oh shit, we launched something and that, again, not a good look, like you said. Like how do you sort of nip that in the bud?
I start by trying to include people outside, and people who occupy whatever blind spot I may have, include them in the process as early as I can. As I mentioned, when I was working on the Hillary campaign, I didn't fully understand what making accessible product meant. I didn't understand what the pain points were in not being able to have certain things. Yeah. So what I did was I talked to people who had visual impairments. I talked to people who had hearing impairments and motor impairments. I asked them what would make it easier for you to interact with what we're building. And once I figured out what that was, I then went back to the appropriate teams and told them, here's what we have to do.
Yeah.
So I just kind of start by trying to understand what I don't know. The problem is when I don't know what I don't know. So that's when I try to pull in people who like have different experiences than me so that they can catch anything that I may not have thought of.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. Sort of a follow-up to that is it's just like, yeah, all right, we want to do the right thing. We want to do, like, what you showed, these different layers, the cake thing was so freaky good. I love that so much.
I can't take credit for it, but I did put the link
but
so you can see the article.
That's incredible. But, like, these different layers, just even what you're showing, like the localization, like these sort of, like, different things. Like, in this context, it looks like this, in this. It's like, that's work. That's like a lot of like active work to make that happen. And one of the things that I encounter a lot in my own work and working with teams is just like, we want to do the right thing that makes sense. We have limited time, budget, resources. We got to get this thing done like yesterday. Mm-hmm. So like, we're just, it's a good thought, but like it doesn't ever materialize. Like how have you sort of like combated that? Because no doubt you've experienced that as well.
Yeah, this is when I become a jerk. I basically put my foot down, like accessibility is a success criteria for this project, and we can't launch without it. And I just like, no, we have to get it done. I was able to, at least on the campaign, the way I described it was, these are actual voters who can't use our site. That's not going to make them inclined to vote for us.
Yeah.
So we probably should make it so the people who want to read what we're trying to say can actually access it. Kind of directing it towards like literal like people seems to be a good way to get those who might be on the fence involved. I've actually been really lucky that most of the people I work with are already on board, and I don't have to do much convincing. But to answer your question more fully, I also just bake accessibility into the estimate when I start with. Like, I just build it that way from the beginning, so that way I don't have to be like, oh crap, I built this thing, and I'll go back and make it accessible, go back and make it functional in these other different cases, because these are not edge cases, they're just different cases.
Yeah.
And so I either build it, I usually just bake it into the estimate, or I put my foot down. It's like, okay, well, something else has to give, because we have to launch with this in place.
Yeah. That's awesome. We could literally talk all day, but we'll park it for now. Everybody, are you around for the rest of the day?
I will be, yes.
Well, yeah, so if you have questions, seek Mina out and all of that. So everybody, give it up for Mina Markham.